Mark Carney's the one that, will be positive for that reset. Canada, China need a reset. Mark Carney's the guy. So, okay, now we've got the Chinese ambassador in Ottawa saying the same thing. Mark Carney secures that meeting with Xi Jinping, with Prime Minister, which is a reward of sorts. Certainly, important in whatever's going on in the tariff negotiations, whether you see that as good or bad. And what comes out of that meeting is, as Charles Burton told me, he's a sinologist. He can read China's write-up of what they say happened. He can see, what Mark Carney said. And he said that Mark Carney's language reflected Chinese Communist Party messaging, that it was time for, a new pragmatic, if I'm recalling correctly, I believe I am, pragmatic relationship between Canada and China. And in the expert Charles Burton's words, that is Chinese Communist Party language.
Sam Cooper, my brother, we are back. Our second annual Christmas extravaganza. How you doing, man?
Doing great.
It's been a few weeks since we spoke, man. Every time it's been a few weeks, I get like a little bit of like performance anxiety before we talk to each other. I'm like,
shaky and nervous.
Yeah, are things still the same? Is everything going to feel right? Yeah. But, we've come together once again for our Christmas special. Last year, we focused on Justin Trudeau and his storied relationship with China. I wouldn't even say his relationship. I would say the people around him and his handlers' relationships with China. Because for all intents and purposes, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but through all of our conversations about this, Sam, it really seems to me like Justin Trudeau was more a figurehead and hostage than anything. Would that be accurate?
There seems to be like, it's more apparent than ever that the theater surrounding Justin Trudeau hasn't ended, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the theater when he, my first knowledge of Justin Trudeau really was, the funeral of Pierre Trudeau, where suddenly he made a shining appearance, and I was impressed by his speech. But in hindsight, I think that was, that was like bringing the bell to the ball for a debut at 19. I'm not saying, that was his debut. And people, I would think, were very intentional about that, and now meeting Japanese diplomats with Katy Perry, I still think the theater's going on. Yeah. I don't want to get off topic because that Justin Trudeau's not the topic of this episode or the second Christmas special, but I just kind of have fun thinking that if I was trying to rehabilitate Justin Trudeau's reputation, after he sort of crashed out in Canada, the steps that are going on with like a photo in, I don't know where he was, off the Greek islands with Katy Perry, after like a little cute little donut shop photo. And then now the couple are meeting Japanese diplomats. It's just all too staged. It's just kind of, I get the feeling that he's not done. He's not done in the networks that he was involved in. But to your point, yeah, he's not the mastermind of things going on in the power centers of Canada while he was there in power for 10 years. He wasn't the mastermind.
Justin Trudeau couldn't mastermind, a rainbow, like he's not. And so last year we went into the Trudeau history with China, which largely revolved around his dad, the people around him, like Dominic Barton, Mark Wiseman, yes, right? And others.
Gerald Butts should have been there.
Exactly. Gerald Butts, like all of the key players who still seem to be orbiting the current prime minister's office. But the difference is, yeah. And so the difference is now we have a prime minister who isn't just a marionette for these people, a pretty face, a Katy Perry dating, island hopping, yacht gallivanter, right? This guy was one of the guys who was advising Trudeau through all of this.
Yes.
So what we're going to focus on today for this special is we are going to track Mark Carney's storied relationship with China and actors acting on behalf of Chinese interests. So, Sam, let's pick a starting point. Where do you want to start for this discussion?
I know you've done a lot of research, so I'm very happy. Like if you volley at me and I probably forget more than I've learned and reported at this point, because you're right. When you're looking at Canada's China policy, it's very much a network of elites that have been pushing forward a policy for 50 years. And as we've talked about, I just did a podcast myself with the author Dennis Molinaro, who did, excellent historic work pointing to Pierre Trudeau recognizing the Chinese Communist Party over Taiwan. Pierre Trudeau became a model for the world, a negative model in how to push, Taiwan aside, and what has happened after that. So starting point on Carney, I mean, what jumps out at me is, we talked before when we were networking, we were getting into one of your favorite investigative areas, the WEF. Yes. And because I was charting how Mark Carney and people like, Michael Bloomberg and Dominic Barton had been circulating in that Davos world for a long time. And we're not talking about any of the wilder conspiracy theories. We're talking about very influential, wealthy people from around the Western world that by being involved in those networks directly got into business with people like Jin Li-kun, who we talked about, the head of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and how Carney and this senior Chinese Communist Party financier got into green dealings around the world. And this is not, there's no conjecture about this. There's literal press statements with Mark Carney and Jin Li-kun, Michael Bloomberg talking about the importance of green development. And why it just jumped back into my mind is another somewhat salacious topic, the Epstein files, which I've never dove in headfirst into whatever theories are surrounding that. Yeah. But as more documents have been pushed out, essentially by the Democratic Party now in the United States, I did a story on how you can't make this stuff up. Jin Li-kun's daughter, so remember, Jin Li-kun, a senior Chinese Communist Party official in charge of so many financial relationships around the world, his daughter was involved in a relationship with Larry Summers, who was the former U.S. Treasury head, a senior Harvard professor. And this is salacious. Larry Summers and Jeffrey Epstein are emailing back and forth about how Larry Summers wants to have a, let's call it a biblical relationship with Jin Li-kun's daughter, who herself is an economist. I believe, London School of Economics. Yeah. Much younger woman. She's in a mentee relationship with Larry Summers. But what comes out of those emails is that it looks like she wants that, relationship with him professionally. And when I take a big step back from this, I think I was probably the first one to point to that part of what has come out of Epstein and said, hey, people are talking about Larry Summers, inappropriate relationship with a younger Chinese woman. I said, maybe the real story here is she was cultivating him for the Chinese Communist Party because this is a senior American financial architect, right? And look who her father is. Look who her father is involved in relationships with Mark Carney, Bloomberg. So you're pointing to, let's call it a Western elite financial network, sometimes center to center left leaning, very often in direct business relationships with China, which is Mark Carney and Bloomberg. So that's why I just wanted to take a giant step back and say, we're talking about tracing networks here, I'm trying to convey to people that, when you look at the relationship between a Mark Carney and a senior Chinese financial figure, you could say that's one instance. You're being mean against our prime minister. You're trying to make it look like he might be influenced. And I'm saying, hey, no, now we've got another piece of evidence that Larry Summers, who for all the world looks like a mirror almost of Mark Carney in terms of his position and influence, looks like he is we don't know which way the influence is going between the daughter of a senior Chinese Communist Party boss. So all to say, like in all my training, whether it's like an AI machine or whether it's my brain trained after 10 years, when you start to see nodes and lines get so close and the same pattern emerging, you're saying this is a network. So what is the network's purpose? And that, hopefully that would give us some avenues to follow on Mark Carney, because, it's hard to know where to start. But Bank of England's, very obviously by that point, so this is after 2010, again, not conjecture, it's on the record that Mark Carney asserts that the Bank of England should be part of a global, did he say global or globalist? I think it was global financial system that can assist China in extending its renminbi or yuan banking to other countries such as Britain. So as I said in one story for the Bureau, whichever way you look at that, Mark Carney at the Bank of England was helping solidify financial relationships between Britain and China. And so there's no linkage between what happened in 2011 when he did that and the spy scandal in Britain now, where it said that insiders in the UK Parliament are siphoning off political intelligence back to the Ministry of State Security. There's no direct line, but as we've talked about, it looks like a senior banking figure from the United Kingdom, who was the national security advisor for Keir Starmer, could have been instrumental in Keir Starmer's government dropping that case. So I pointed to too many dots already, but I'm looking at patterns here.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the Bank of England and opening up the renminbi to London, because that doesn't sound like much to a casual observer, but for people listening to this, what you have to understand is what he's doing in that moment is he is taking a big step forward for China's currency in challenging the USD. That's essentially what they're doing, right? Is that they are giving China's currency a large platform to compete against the USD and reduce the USD's influence on a global scale. Correct, Sam?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. And I read your story on the Larry Summers thing, because I thought that was interesting, because it seems to me like every mainstream media source that reported the story was intentionally overlooking that aspect of it. Did it seem that way to you?
The way the story broke, people were still acting like it's the Me Too era of 5-6 years ago. Yeah. Fair enough. If that's your frame of reference, this is an icky relationship from a formerly untouchable American, essentially like a boss of its elite. And so, yeah, that's what people hammered him for. He had to step back. Mm-hmm. And if they didn't, he'd probably still be in his position. But I did see, I think, I was the first to point out that relationship there. And from my point of view, the CCP influence angle for the citizens of the world is more important than Larry Summers being icky towards his mentee, right? Because other things might have been going on there, and probably were. And I think, after a week or two, there were some American media platforms that picked up a little bit on who this woman was. I forget if it was the Wall Street Journal or someone else reported that she is potentially seen as one of the most important voices, from China in sort of promoting China as, not an alternative, but another good economic model, right? So that gets back exactly to what we're talking about. Mark Carney promoting the renminbi system as, you know, a worthy extension of the world's financial system. And you're right. At the end of the day, China cannot contest the United States for leadership of the world, which is what it wants to do by 2050, without providing an alternative to the US dollar. So this is, I mean, I would argue it's in the realm of hybrid warfare. What's going on in global banking, cryptocurrency, you know, AI data centers, and the power we need for them will be the same as currency, basically, as Elon Musk said recently. You know, energy will be currency. So all these things are related. So if Mark Carney, using his senior banking position in the United Kingdom, is instrumental in helping China extend its system, I don't think that's good for the Western world. I really don't.
Yes, and that's the first symptom of what's to come. And, you know, what's interesting here is, look, when we talk about Mark Carney, his name is almost synonymous with Brookfield Asset Management. But the truth is, Mark Carney didn't sign on to Brookfield until after he left the Bank of England. Prior to that, Mark Carney is a part of Goldman Sachs, right, which is another huge financial, just a financial juggernaut in the world. So what we have here is a guy who is, you know, in and out of different bureaucracies, whether it's the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, the United Nations, these governmental organizations or quasi-governmental organizations. And then, well, at the same time, with another foot in Wall Street, another foot in finance, which is highly dangerous. And this is the thing that I think most mainstream Canadian liberals have chosen to overlook, because I don't think they really understand the level of the conflict of interest involved in the things that Mark Carney has done and continues to do. So, Sam, let's take a step forward. After the Bank of England, he goes over to Brookfield. You spoke earlier about the network, this network. Can you break down who the key figures inside that network and all of their connections to China?
Well, I mean, Brookfield's, this is just a network of elites, many from Quebec, that have been the wealthy people of Canada for decades, right? And so by Mark Carney jumping in and taking the leadership of that, as I testified in Parliament, you know, within the recent months, for the ethics committee, they were interested in my reporting on Mark Carney's role with Brookfield and how that crossed over to the networks you're talking about. And so I didn't talk about Dominic Barton or Michael Sabia or some of the other people we've talked about before in this Eastern Canada network of networks of people that have been very, I think you called them, if we're talking about Canada's deep state, it's not a stretch to say, you know, this starts from business titans in Eastern Canada and how they influence the policy, as it turns out, mostly of the Liberal government, because the Liberal government is in power 80% of the time. So, I mean, we could talk a lot about Dominic Barton and Mark Carney and Michael Sabia, but to lean on what I testified, you know, the most, what jumped out to me in Brookfield's dealings with China, which would raise the peak concern of potential conflicts, included back in the 2015, 2016 era, Brookfield gets into, I believe, about a $750 million investment in high-end real estate in Shanghai. And so as this was at the peak of China's real estate market, which has since had some very hard times. And so this investment is in trouble 2024. Mark Carney, who is now the boss of Brookfield, is part of the team that goes over to Beijing, meets with Xi Jinping. He also meets, I believe, with the senior leadership of the Bank of China. I believe also with the mayor of should be Shanghai. So he meets with the elite of the Chinese Communist Party. Brookfield's near $1 billion investment in Shanghai is in deep trouble. And after these meetings, the Bank of China issues something like a $125 million bridge loan to Brookfield so that it can, I guess, refinance at a pretty good rate some of its project there in Shanghai. And so, as I told the people in the ethics committee, that's a loan that I think any sensible person would say there could be politically sensitive, whether you want to call it strings or just a line. The Bank of China in itself is a Chinese Communist Party entity. Mark Carney traveling over to Beijing prior to this loan being issued, it's beneficial both to Xi Jinping, and at the end of the day, whether a string is tied or not, it turns out to be beneficial to Brookfield, obviously, to get this bridge loan. Taking a step back into that relationship, who of Western companies can invest in real estate in China? Only people given the gatekept access by the Chinese Communist Party. Furthermore, Shanghai is a high-end real estate market where, only the CCP elites and very, very connected people in China have these types of properties. So for Brookfield to be in on that asset, that shows a type of access and a type of privileged access. Furthermore, as I told the committee, I was interested that an investor from Hong Kong, who was the partner with Brookfield in this, is part of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is a central united front body. This is what the Chinese Communist Party uses to bring people from all walks of life, whether it's business, any other area. And it's not nominally the CCP, but it's controlled by the CCP. So it's like the CCP kind of tossing out goodies to people that come into this political body. Furthermore, when I'm really digging into my memory of the story, I found it interesting that this Hong Kong tycoon who had invested with, Brookfield, in his own comments, he called investment into Hong Kong's market a way for Beijing to ensure that, Western elite business persons would still be able to invest in China, but on Beijing's terms. So that in itself, I say, there's a lot of data points there that suggest that Carney and Brookfield being invested in that near $1 billion real estate play before he gets a, sort of an emergency loan secured. Now he's Prime Minister of Canada. What could stop people in Beijing from using that as some sort of leverage? And that's one deal. But I'll just take one more giant step back, and something that I learned from this new book from Dennis Molinaro, Under Assault, is that the Canada-China Business Council, which is, you asked me at the start of this question to point to some of the networks involved. I learned that the Canada-China Business Council was in part the creation of what's called a suspected Chinese spy, who is an academic from originally the University of BC, later McGill, who this book reveals was tasked to get Canada or the United States to recognize the CCP over Taiwan. And so this was an influence operation. Looks like it targeted Pierre Trudeau. looks like it was successful, is what the author indicates. And I learned from the author that the Canada-China Business Council itself was, partly created by this agent whose job was to influence Western elites so that they would choose China's policies. So if Brookfield is investing in China in a project like that, I say it looks like, the type of thing that would be funneled through the Canada-China Business Council or gatekeepers such as this man, Paul Lin. I don't know that he's involved or a successor of him is involved, but that's the system to invest with Beijing, and that's the system that Mark Carney's part of.
Now, something I want to point out here. Typically, Chinese communist dictators are not people that you can just get on the phone or enter a room and speak with. There are members of the CCP and United Front Work Department and other agencies, high up top members who have still never met Xi Jinping. So for a guy like Mark Carney to be able to, one, not only invest, $750 million in Shanghai real estate, but then to request an audience with Xi Jinping himself when that investment starts to go south, that signals some pretty significant power, right?
Yeah, and we don't know if Carney requested the audience or vice versa. But your point that you don't get in a room with Xi Jinping unless you're a very serious player or they want you to be in that room. Any number of I'm looking at other stories that have come out of U.S. indictments where it looks like a former director of the CIA who now is, I think, suffering Alzheimer's. So he's called an unindicted co-conspirator in a case that I was looking at involving many different people involved in, the East Coast let's call it the academic and business elites of China, targeting people like Hunter Biden. I mean, this person, James Woolsey, the indictment I read suggested that, he would be granted access, I believe, with Xi Jinping as part of, it looks like, some sort of influence play. And in that case, it was all about, a senior Chinese spy was trying to get someone in a senior security position in the Trump 1.0 administration. And James Woolsey, who was kind of tied up, again, the former CIA director, tied up in an influence operation, was puppeting op-eds from China Daily, or in fact, I believe wrote op-eds for China Daily suggesting why China's Belt and Road project was good, attractive policy for America to get involved in. So, I mean, for you to meet with Xi Jinping, it's because you're the type of person that will use your position, like a Larry Summers did, to argue that the Belt and Road is good policy, or like a Mark Carney did to argue that Beijing's renminbi remittance system should have swap lines with UK's central bank. These are high level financial and geopolitical objectives of Beijing. So yeah, those 10 or 12 business people that are pictured along with Mark Carney and Xi Jinping are in that class of global elite Western business people that China either wants to curry favor with or already has, I believe.
Okay, so while we're here, I want to talk about Bloomberg a little bit because, again, when we talk about Mark Carney, his name is always synonymous with Brookfield, but he is also part of Bloomberg, or was. Now, Sam, can you talk about Bloomberg, why they're important to the story, and what their connection is to China?
Yeah, so Bloomberg and Mark Carney are the two, sort of senior global business person entities that were involved with this Jin Li-kun, who I mentioned at the start of our conversation, former head of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And they were involved with him. Again, this is not conjecture. People can pull up the press releases and see Michael Bloomberg, Jin Li-kun, Mark Carney, ESG green investment in Brazil. That's one clear project that I remember. So who's Bloomberg? Why are he and Mark Carney sort of fellow business travelers? I mean, there's a tremendous rabbit hole about how a great reporter for Bloomberg named Michael Forsyth, he's now with the New York Times, this is back in around 2016, 2015, did an incredible deep dive into how Xi Jinping and his family and other senior Chinese Communist Party Politburo leaders have billions of dollars around the world. So this was pointing directly at Xi Jinping. And there's all kinds of writing from Michael Forsyth and his wife, who's also sort of in I believe, the think tank NGO type field, how this story for Bloomberg was much too hot to handle, and it got spiked by Bloomberg. The threat, I guess, was that Bloomberg sells its high-value data terminals in China. They're used in China, as they are around the world. And I believe the story is, if this expose of Xi Jinping and his family's money was published on Bloomberg in their investigation, a huge bombshell story, that the terminals would be shut off. So it gets a little bit, as worrying. I think that Michael Forsyth and his family in China were unsafe. I believe there may have been threats. They had to leave. And then he went on and reported the same story for New York Times, really poetically sticking it to Bloomberg, the story that they spiked, an obvious story of the most importance, in understanding what really is the ruling structure in China, which is corruption at the highest levels. That story, I think it's just really the perfect anecdote to understand Michael Bloomberg's business in China and how Beijing has leverage over business people that are invested in China, which takes us back to Mark Carney and Brookfield. We don't know, because of his ethical screen with what is it, 99, 100, 102 potential conflicts. Maybe he has cut off the tentacle of being tied to that particular $1 billion, roughly, Brookfield investment in Shanghai real estate. We don't know, but I'm talking about Michael Bloomberg being leveraged by Beijing because of his deep investments in China, which is the case study that proves the point that Mark Carney should be similarly potentially leveraged if he's still invested with Brookfield, which...
Right. So, and this is the thing, like, this is what I wanted to get to, because, look, Mark Carney goes over to China, meets direct with Xi Jinping, right? They sit down, and he leaves having secured a $276 million loan from the bank.
It was 125.
It's 276. I checked it this morning. It's 276.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, good. Thank you for correcting me on
all these numbers, billions and trillions, Sam. We get lost in it. Once you're past 100 million, it doesn't matter anymore. But 276 million was a number that I read this morning. So that means that he had to have had some serious financial leverage and negotiating power in order to walk into a scenario where the firm that he chairs is losing money on a $750 million investment and then secures a $250 million loan from the Bank of China, right? And you have to understand that they're not just going to hand this out there is a little bit of a give and take there. So what is he giving to China, I guess, is the question in that situation, right?
I mean, we don't even have to have evidence that anything was given or taken. It's the fact that the vulnerability is there. And Bank of China is a CCP entity. This is not any normal country. It's not like he had an investment in New York City and the Bank of America, or JP Morgan Chase was thinking, well, we think the real estate market is going to come back, so let's give him a loan of $300 million with terms that are good for the bank, and that's good underwriting. No, it is the Bank of China does not make that loan without senior Chinese Communist Party members saying make that loan. I don't think so. Did Mark Carney give anything for that? I don't know. But even the fact of him standing in a picture with Xi Jinping in a couple of years ago, while China's market is crashing and desperately in need of investment from foreigners, don't get it wrong. Even if China is, to jump into another topic, threatening Japan with fiery hell, they still, behind the scenes, will be talking to Japan and say, please don't pull your investments out, right? They deeply need money from other countries, or else their whole economy, is in danger. So Mark Carney standing in a picture with Xi Jinping as a global business leader is already giving something to Xi. Maybe not enough to secure a $276 million loan, but it's relational, right?
Yes. Well, so let me pose this to you, because now we're kind of moving on in the story here. And I have my notes here, but just for the sake of us continuing this conversation, I also believe that as the governor of the Bank of England, he secured a $1 billion investment in China's Belt and Road Initiative projects, wow. Right?
I didn't know that. That's a nice find.
People can fact check me. Here, let me pull it up. I'm not going to edit any of this out. Sorry, guys. I've you know what's funny, dude? And I told you this before we started recording, and I put a post on this about this on X, but I've been doing a ton of research on this because I wanted to come correct for this conversation, because the thing about the Trudeau special is that it was pretty straightforward. The guy's an idiot. He got caught in a million different things. So there was so much stuff we could talk about, right? But what's tricky with Mark Carney is that he's no dummy, and that the things that he's done and the moves that he's made have all been very, very calculated and cunning. And so in digging into this, it's hard to decipher between, what is legitimate above board business, because look, the truth is China's a leading world economy, right? A world leading economy, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're involved in any business, it's smart to do business with them, right? So what is above board business, just regular business, and what is some pretty scary globalist, underhanded World Economic Forum type shit? And that's what's been difficult about all this for me is deciphering between what's legit and what isn't. Yeah,
I mean, while you look up more on this deal, because I think that's huge. Let's remember, okay, to your point, what is a legit trade or business with China and what is not? Remember, we talked about Dominic Barton being examined in, Ottawa hearings and being asked by the Conservative MP Garnet Genuis, can you tell us, Mr. Barton, with your role at McKinsey, did you directly advise these Chinese state entities on their building of illegal, structures in South China Sea as part of their military expansion? And Mr. Barton hemmed and hawed and couldn't give any answer. So very clearly, when you're from a McKinsey or a Brookfield, or you're a Larry Summers at Harvard, and you are advising Western nations to be involved in Xi Jinping's Belt and Road project, the Belt and Road is part of China's military expansion. Mm-hmm. As I've said, the US State Department sees it as part of China's use of organized crime around the world to recycle what I'm told, corruption money. There's bribes involved. I believe in focusing on, let's say, Southeast Asia. They can take over deep water ports by sort of, getting the local government to take massive loans, and then the loans go underwater and China takes over, a piece of potential military, infrastructure. So the Belt and Road is bad news. People, you can look it up and see enough reporting from the CBC or pick any global media company, and they'll have written on the Belt and Road and concerns with it. Again, just like the financial system, this is China competing to be hegemon with the United States, but doing it in a much more dirty, corrupt way than the United States could ever come up with, even in the past.
Yeah.
Even in the past. So I said Larry Summers, who was, I found very interestingly connected to the family that Mark Carney, we can connect, was involved in promoting the Belt and Road. People can read. James Woolsey, the now senile, suffering Alzheimer's former CIA director, was involved in some type of scheme in promoting the Belt and Road, being influenced by a senior Chinese spy, the same one, by the way, that targeted Hunter Biden.
And I just want to jump in here, because I don't want to downplay the significance of this. The former CIA director, the former director of the nucleus of the American global deep state, was caught in a conspiracy to promote Belt and Road Initiative ideology.
Yeah, thank you for let me unpack that for 1 minute. The case is incredible. I've reported on it a number of times at the Bureau. James Woolsey is part of this Eastern United States think tank with a guy named Gal Luft, who's an Israeli-American academic. Gal Luft is working with a Chinese quote-unquote oil company whose director is the same one that gave Hunter Biden an $80,000 ring, is the same one that's in the Hunter Biden laptop.
Yeah.
And another guy in that case is the one that targeted James Woolsey and was giving him talking points and editorials to write on why the Belt and Road Project is good American policy and what they were trying to do with the former CIA director, who's at the end of his career and losing, his mental acuity, is they hoped to place a senior security figure in the Trump 1.0 administration. So think about that. They wanted someone in the Trump cabinet controlled by China, James Woolsey. And when we're talking, it's the same network targeting the Biden family, the big guy, all of this stuff. When you follow China enough, I think, as we're demonstrating in this conversation, certain themes, certain people keep popping up. And what we're talking about here is why Mark Carney, you say, which I never knew, this is quite the data point.
Here, I'll
he gave him, read it.
I have it right here. It says, as governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney deepened UK-China financial relations by approving a deal granting Chinese banks access to London's currency market and creating a $1 billion investment fund supporting China's Belt and Road Initiative, participated in multiple high-level dialogues, including AI and green finance discussions, earning praise for facilitating Beijing's global financial integration.
The thing that I didn't know there is the Belt and Road, which is huge. I already had enough of an idea by Mark Carney paving the way for that financial conduit between the Bank of China and the Bank of England. That's enough. But the Belt and Road on top of it, $1 billion investment, to me, that's the smoking gun, right? And so now when we look at why could the Keir Starmer government not prosecute a case of insiders in Westminster, the Britain Parliament, selling out, MPs that were critical of Beijing, it's precisely because it looks like people like Mark Carney have forged such a financial tie and a geopolitical tie between Beijing and the UK that if the UK goes to act on that laterally now in 2025, it is very difficult to do so because China has their hooks in so deep. So look, I mean, thank you for raising that because I had no idea.
I'm just proud that after 2 years of doing this, I could tell you something you didn't know. That's all.
But I mean, look at that. This is a good investigative conversation because Mark Carney over 10 years ago was very obviously instrumental to helping Beijing secure deep ties financially and otherwise into Britain. And we see, I believe, Britain struggling or as Canada trying to stay afloat. As Dennis Molinaro in his book, Under Assault, says, Canada's trying to stay afloat. Looks like Britain is too. And the reason would be people like Mark Carney in both countries make these deep deals with Beijing. And, that's how Beijing gets leverage to send its, spies into our diasporas, harass, maybe even lethally target people, if I'm really being honest about what's starting to emerge in other files.
Yeah.
So, Mark Carney, clearly, thank you for raising that because it just strengthens the case that he was instrumental in setting Britain's direction over a decade ago.
Well, yeah. And look, for people watching this, just to break down what the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, the way it operates in the same way that the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund have classically operated on behalf of the American hegemonic interests. They go into a country that's struggling, that's failing with the BRI, most notably Western African nations, right? Help them build their infrastructure, give them huge, gigantic loans that they could never hope to pay back. And then once they're sinking, they have them on the hook and they can strip them for whatever they're after there, whether that's rare earth minerals, other resources, or just political influence, right? Geopolitical influence. This is the way these things work. They go into a struggling nation or a nation that has just suffered a huge natural disaster, make these gigantic, over the top loans with interest rates that would make it impossible for that nation to ever pay back. And then from that point forward, that nation is under their thumb. Correct, Sam?
Absolutely. And to put the cherry on the top, they should be pretty involved in corrupting the leaders that sign off on that. So there's absolutely no chance that the nation will ever get out from under that deal.
Yeah. And from that point forward, the citizens of that nation, the people who are taxpayers, the people who are contributing to the overall betterment of that nation are actually working for the parent nation, which in the case of a lot of African nations and other places in the world was and has been China. And so, Sam, going back to Mark Carney now, what's interesting here is that it seems like no matter where he is, whether it's Goldman Sachs, Brookfield, he's working with Bloomberg, he's on the board at the World Economic Forum, he's the governor of the Bank of Canada, now Prime Minister of Canada. It seems like he's got a long resume. Seems like he keeps going back to the Beijing well. Do you see the same pattern here?
I definitely see. I wish I'd like to say I knew more about what he was doing at Goldman Sachs. I should, but I don't. But yeah, I'd agree.
Well, I can break it down for you, Sam, because I know a little bit about this thanks to my conversations with Michelle Sterling. What he was doing at Goldman Sachs was he was essentially instrumental in setting up the global carbon trade system. Mark Carney got in on this. This isn't a discussion around the validity of the climate change crisis, right? We're not here to talk about that today. So no matter how you view it, whether the world is on fire or the world's not on fire, that doesn't matter. what happened was around the time that Al Gore and his documentary and the global climate change crisis emerged in the public consciousness, Mark Carney, Goldman Sachs, and a long host of others were in the business of creating the global carbon tax and carbon trade system. Okay, so that was a lot of what he was doing at Goldman Sachs. I don't know what connection that had to China, but even recently, and we still have more to talk about in the past, but in present day, Mark Carney talks a lot about working with China and being on the same page in terms of green initiatives. Right now, what that sounds like to people who don't know what's actually going on, it sounds like they're coming together in order to make the world a better place. But what they're actually talking about is the $1 trillion carbon trade markets and all of the money to be made there and all of the crises to be exploited financially. And that's what China is in on with Mark Carney and on a long host of others. And see, what's interesting to me, and the reason why I wanted us to do this for the Christmas special, aside from keeping up with tradition, is that this is a much bigger story. Because again, going back to Justin Trudeau, Justin Trudeau is just kind of like this floppy-haired dork who doesn't know what he's doing. He just wants to be on a beach smoking weed, and now he's talking, he's in a private meeting with the world's largest money launderer, right? Like, he's just a puppet. But Mark Carney is the puppet master. He's the guy who's pulling the strings, which is what makes this so interesting. Because again, we're trying to dissect what is legitimate from illegitimate, and the further you dive into it, the more you realize that most of it is illegitimate.
I mean, to your question of him going back to the well with Beijing, yeah, Bank of England financially ties to Bank of China, Belt and Road. At Brookfield, along with Bloomberg, again, dealing with Jin LeCun, senior CCP financier, and the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank, right? Over to the World Economic Forum, also with Jin LeCun and people like Michael Bloomberg promoting those green development agendas that you speak of. And when you say that, global carbon capture is $1 trillion financial system, something like that, that just tells me, although I haven't researched it like you have, it's, yet another global financial system that, of course, Beijing will be angling to have deep involvement and influence over. And in its competition with the United States, its aim will be to have controlling interest, which should be why, as you and I have said, if we see certain people traveling together at meetings in Davos, states will be there that aren't friendly, to the United States at the end of the day. American industrialist tycoons will be there. And so the question, more than ever, for these Western tycoons is, in their business dealings, are they thinking about the sovereignty and economic integrity of their nation? Or are they going to become increasingly like these people in the global South that we're talking about that sell out their nations to, lethal loans from Beijing that will end up having, the citizens of these more impoverished nations working for, their client, Beijing, for the rest of their lives. So, I taken a giant leap back and seeing the big picture in this conversation today. Again, I do think this is part of the President Donald Trump tariff tantrum. They're looking at, can they, in this kind of like deeply embedded struggle for control of world finances, which at the end of the day will have military applications. This is part of the struggle that I think a lot of people aren't seeing in terms of, trade, tariffs, financial flows. Who controls the financial flows?
Right. And another thing that I want to point out to our listeners is that this loan that is secured by Mark Carney for Brookfield from the Bank of China occurs shortly before he's parachuted in as leader of the Liberal Party in Canada and runs for the office of Prime Minister. And Sam, I don't know if that's just a coincidence, but it seems like it's a little too on the nose to be coincidental, right?
I mean, it's pretty close. It's pretty close. And this is another thing that came up in my questioning at the Ottawa's Ethics Committee. You know, I presented the view, like Democracy Watch, you know, a watchdog over transparency in Canada, that we don't have strong ethical regimes. And I was asked how long is long enough for someone to be involved in a corporation and then walk into, government where they might be, ethically exposed. And I said, look, clearly academic literature shows that there should be a cooling off period, right? A cooling off period of years. So for Mark Carney in charge of Brookfield to secure a $276 million emergency loan for that Brookfield investment in Shanghai, and then within weeks or months become the Prime Minister of Canada, that is way, way too close for comfort, way too close.
Right. And that's, I mean, it's not a coincidence, right? And it's, to me, the way I see it, just through my reading and, reading your work and, mostly the Bureau. I don't know if I've mentioned it yet in this episode, but as I was researching, virtually everywhere I looked was citing Sam Cooper. So it was like, I might as well just go back and read the Bureau. But it just seems like this is like Canada. It seems like Canada was uniquely vulnerable at a time where the race toward globalism is nearing the finish line. And the United States, who happens to border our country, is really the last world empire that could threaten the completion of that race.
However you look at globalism or immigration or national security, there's no question in my mind that United States government has gotten very belligerent within the past few weeks about telling other Western nations that they're essentially not Western nations anymore. And their openness to global trade and immigration has turned them into threats. This is what the United States government is saying, and it's bothering a lot of people. It's pissing off European leaders. But look, I mean, I've said it a number of times. If people understood, I believe, how close we are to war, with China threatening to invade Taiwan, basically now threatening Japan, as we've talked about before.
Yeah.
If Taiwan falls, who's next? And it's just, what more proof do you need, people? Like in the past week, a PLA jet locked radar on a Japanese jet. Like things are getting very hot. And again, to your point, the US being the last bastion of, if you want to call it, freedom or markets that are capitalistic and not controlled by, central planning and central bankers. Yeah, you can make that argument, you can make that argument.
Well, I mean, it's also too, it's like, I've heard the argument before when talking to people about the Belt and Road Initiative, and they say, well, how is this any different than what the United States has done with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund? And my response is always the same, and it's very simple. And I'm sorry, Miss Cooper, for the language, but these are fucking communists. Like, have you learned nothing? Right? Like it's like, we just listen. A lot of people do a lot of bad things around the world, the United States specifically, but they're not communists. You know what I mean? Like, at least there's some sort of constitutional framework that keeps that that country operational in some way, shape, or form, and the people relatively free.
They don't face, citizens do not yet face police knocking on their door for saying that someone that raped someone. I'm talking about, there's an interesting story coming out where the US Deputy Department of State went over to Europe and said, because I am under diplomatic immunity, I can go to my, internet and say something that you can't if you're a European citizen. And she read off some news report about a woman going to jail for calling a rapist a filthy pig, right? So yeah, the United States and its efforts to invest around the world and secure some influence is not the same as the Chinese Communist Party doing Belt and Road deals, which I'm told and believe involve the laundering of drug money, fentanyl money, synthetic narcotics, corruption of foreign leaders. You're right. Yeah. The U.S. plays rough, but they do have checks and balances, and it's still, the place in the world where, you've got some protection between yourself and a tyrannical government in the United States.
Yes, and just to underscore something Sam just said, that story. I'm not going to say the word here because I know Miss Cooper's ears are very sensitive and I don't want to mar your reputation. Yeah. But she didn't call him a filthy pig. She called him another word. But this was a man, or maybe this is a different story. But this was a word, an F word that she had used in a private conversation with a friend in description of a man who had raped her. Right? Now, in a just society, that dude would be hanging from a tree. But instead, in the society that is coming to fruition in Europe, she faces legal ramifications for saying something mean about somebody who violated her to the very essence of who she is as a human being, right? So that's that, right? And I just want to clarify that for people so that they understand the road that we're on. And Mark Carney is a key figure in this road, as we have just illustrated for the last hour. He's not somebody who just showed up out of the blue, some banker who showed up to lead Canada away from the Trudeau era. He, in my opinion, showed up as the executioner, the guy to put the bullet in our sovereignty once and for all. So Sam, let's bring us this present day to recent months. Let's talk about his arrival on the Canadian political scene. How did that happen? Do you have any insight on that? How does he just magically go from being a shadow advisor to our floppy-haired idiot Prince Trudeau to now being positioned as the next leader of our country?
I wish I would have thought more sharply about that question before posed to me, but I recall very much that there's a big missing piece in the story of how Justin Trudeau. Let me backtrack and timeline this. Remember that Chrystia Freeland was going to give a budget, and there was some sort of please correct me and jump in with some facts, but to me, there's an untold story about what was going on between Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, and Mark Carney. This is the time period back in 2024 when Trudeau is taking the Liberal Party under, and it's very clear that a Pierre Poilievre Conservative Party will trounce the Liberals like they haven't been trounced in a long time. People were thinking this may be the end of the Liberal Party, but Mark Carney suddenly shows up on the scene as a potential successor. Justin Trudeau, somewhere in this plot, it's like Chrystia Freeland was going to refuse to deliver the budget.
Yes.
And a story is floated on the Globe and Mail that, Justin Trudeau is considering bringing in Mark Carney as to replace Chrystia Freeland.
Yes.
But something happens where it's not to replace Chrystia Freeland. Everyone's surprised, and I'm jumping a few steps ahead. It's actually Mark Carney that appears to be the one that was going to replace both of them.
Yeah.
And Chrystia Freeland's now out of the picture. And as we know, Justin Trudeau is off traipsing around with Katy Perry. But like, if you raise the theory that the powers that be in the Liberal Party believed it was time to bring Mark Carney in, it was his time. There's a lot of unknown details, but there's something going on there for sure. That it looks like Trudeau was surprised by what happened. It looks like Freeland felt that she had a path, and then suddenly she's tossed out of the way. Then we get into the election period. Remember, the Chinese Communist Party and its senior propaganda organs are attacking Chrystia Freeland. This comes out from the election interference threat monitor. Mark Carney is being supported in propaganda by the Chinese Communist Party. As you know, there's stories that come out in Mandarin language media that Carney will be the tough fighter against, President Donald Trump. So, like I said, I haven't thought like in detail recently about all of these reports that I did in the past, but it does look like, if you ask me, how did Mark Carney probably become Canada's prime minister? He took the baton from Justin Trudeau, who wasn't willing to give him the baton for a while.
Yeah.
Justin Trudeau somehow, it's like someone came in and tripped him while he thought he still had a slight chance, right? And then here we are. So there's a lot going on there, but I think it brings it back to the theme of the conversation. 100% confidence, I can say Beijing wanted Mark Carney to be the new leader in Canada. They didn't want Justin Trudeau. Exactly. There's a lot going on there, but back to your point of, Mark Carney securing the loan for Brookfield and, the timing, there's just so many kind of data points in that timeline that do indicate that Mark Carney was going to be the guy to rescue the Liberal Party of Canada. And we know the Chinese Communist Party wanted him to be the new leader for Canada, to set a reset in relations between Beijing and Ottawa. We can read this. I'll give you one more thing, a big story. Credit to the Globe and Mail. They broke a story about Mark Carney meeting with, one of these, let's just call it a Chinese-linked business entity in Toronto during the campaign. And there were reports that got pulled off the web after Mark Carney denied, elements of the meeting, where basically these Chinese intelligence propagandists, because I'm just going to come out and say what's going on in that meeting. There's a bunch of pictures of Mark Carney with some Chinese communist spies from the Toronto area. And the propagandist that does a write-up says, they discussed how it looks like this can be a reset for relations between China and Canada. So here we are. He wins the election, and what happens? He has said that Canada is doing a strategic re-engagement with China as a strategic ally, right? And that there's a lot of complexities there. Obviously, he could be using that as leverage in negotiations with Washington, who he obviously, he hopes to secure some good deal for Canada. But that's how he got in, and that's what's happened since. And it looks like that's what China wanted to happen before.
Okay, so let me timeline this out, Sam, and you could tell me, you could stop me along the way, and we can discuss. But just to kind of cap it all off, because I think this is the big moment, and you spotlighted something that I really want to dig into here. So here you have Mark Carney, former governor banking of England, former governor Bank of Canada, Brookfield Asset Management chair, board member at the World Economic Forum, also the UN climate czar. I mean, this guy is in virtually every organization. goes over to Beijing, meets personally with Xi Jinping, secures a $250 million loan for a bad real estate investment and investment in green tech in Beijing or in China. Over in Canada, Chrystia Freeland gets this budget that she doesn't want to deliver because it's horrific, right? Justin Trudeau attempts to pressure her into delivering it. There's this, back and forth, whatever. She's a terrible person, so whatever happens to her, I don't give a shit. But, the idea is posed that, well, maybe we'll bring in Mark Carney. Mark Carney can deliver the budget. She resigns under the pressure. It seems to me during this period that there is this rush to jam Mark Carney in there. And the reason I think that there's this rush to get him in there for whatever powers that be it Power Corporation in Montreal, the Laurentian elites, the liberal power brokers in Canada, who are very closely tied to China, as me and Sam have discussed in the past. I think the race to get him in there is because you have Trump in the United States talking about tariffs, talking about starting to leveling the playing field with Canada and other nations in terms of trade. And I think they saw this as a huge opportunity to move Canada closer to China, which is far more beneficial for the power brokers in Eastern Canada than it is for them to be attached to the United States. And I think the rush to get Carney in there was for that purpose. For the exact thing we're seeing now is a deepening of the relationship with China and a distancing of the relationship with the United States. I personally believe that was the point. I can't, because it was just a huge rush to jam Mark Carney in there. Tons of money spent. Of course, Carney being, close with Michael Bloomberg. He gets tons of positive press coverage in the United States, ends up on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, all sorts of things, right? Like you could see the rollout, but it was done in a very short period of time. And I think it was because they knew they had a very small window of opportunity. And I think they took it. And that's how we ended up here.
It could be, because when you look at what's happened since, it's followed the plot of whether we like it or not, whether Mark Carney is trying to use China as leverage to get a better deal with Washington, which you couldn't fault him for. I'm trying to see it in the best light, but I can't see it in a best light for Mark Carney to call China a strategic ally. That's just wrong. That will not be good for any Canadian, even if he was using it as a smart leverage. Yes. He's been going in the wrong direction. There's no question. And so certainly, the powers that be in the Liberal Party apparently believe that Mark Carney was the one to save the party as it was facing Justin Trudeau not willing to take that walk in the snow and walk away. Everyone wanted him to. He was holding on, and a lot of interesting things happened. So to me, what happened there is it looked like at the very end of the day, Justin Trudeau got tricked and betrayed by, the senior party elites that he might have thought were still on his side. I remember Daryl Bricker, a good pollster, put it in a nice way. He said, when you looked at Justin Trudeau in his kind of, let's call it the Roman moment, when he walks out to address the press, when he has all like the knives in his back, Daryl Bricker said he looks like a man betrayed. He doesn't understand what happened to him. So he believed, I think when Chrystia Freeland put out her resignation letter, there was all kinds of shocking things. And, Trudeau knows he's done. And in all that smoke and dust, Mark Carney is the guy that comes out of it. And as we've talked about, and you said just now, he didn't just hit the ground running. He hit the ground with like a rocket ship, and all these things fell into place for him. He was the guy. So, certainly powerful people wanted him to save the party. And did people that are, close to both the Liberal Party of Canada and the Chinese Communist Party of Beijing, want the same things, and through Carney? Yeah, I think there's probably good fairness to that. Yeah.
So let's, Sam, I have my notes here in front of me, so I just want to get those open because I know we're running out of time here, and I did want to get into the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and their connection to the World Economic Forum, because I think that one is an important part of this story as well. Sam, would you mind just telling people what the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is?
Yeah, this is the Beijing's answer to the United States that it will have, what it called a multilateral institution where it gets, to partner with all these global nations on investment projects, many of them in the global south or sort of poor countries, pitched as, this is benevolent, non-threatening China being another funding source for positive world projects, which will bring people out of poverty. It doesn't just have to be the United States and, Europe and Canada sort of issuing loans. It can be China too. But as we know, a Canadian public relations executive named Bob Picard goes and works for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and his boss, Jin Li-kun, Bob Picard, as I've talked to him and written about, believed in good faith that he was working for a multilateral, just like, the World Bank. And he found out that no, he had, Chinese Communist Party handlers trying to follow him around. Mm-hmm. He had, as he explained it to me in a podcast, there was a group of people around the president, Jin Li-kun, who's a senior, sort of red educated leader that were secretly controlling what the what the bank was up to, right? So it's pitched to the rest of the world that, your country will partner with it. Your taxpayers will be paying into dual projects that will, benefit the world, benefit, let's say, Canada, benefit Beijing. But it's a Chinese Communist Party op to be like buried into these investments, spying on people that are, involved in projects, extending Beijing's leverage. So in a simple term, it's a CCP op. And Bob Picard had to escape China when he realized how bad things were.
Yeah,
he feared for his safety. He had to fly out. He now, he continues to be, smeared by Chinese Communist Party actors, but he knows who Jin Li-kun is. He knows who Jin Li-kun's daughter is. He knows, people come to the Bureau and read my interviews with Bob Picard. He knows how to assess what's going around the world with Beijing's, let's call it loan leverage diplomacy. That's what the that bank is.
Yeah. And so just to put it simply, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is the finance and banking arm of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Sam, what is their connection to the World Economic Forum? Do you have any insight on that?
Just to the extent I remember doing a couple of stories where all you had to do is scan through the website and see this guy, Jin Li-kun. Let's not forget that for people that like a little bit more salacious material, his daughter now reflected in the Jeffrey E. Epstein emails with Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury boss. So Jin Li-kun and the Infrastructure Investment Bank, are on WEF materials where they're talking about, the benefits of socially responsible investment worldwide or green investment. So do I know that he is like a sort of, was he on the board or did he have the level of influence of Mark Carney at the WEF? I don't know about that, but I know that you can go into their materials and likely find Jin Li-kun, the leader of the bank, in many forums with Carney, Dominic Barton, etc.
Yes. The reason I wanted to bring that out is because China has an obscene amount of influence with this World Economic Forum, which, if people want to go down that rabbit hole, just look up Henry Kissinger's involvement with the establishing of the World Economic Forum, and I think you'll get an idea of what they are.
Before you go on, you launch into that, but I just learned something today. Again, I did a podcast with Dennis Molinaro, who wrote the book Under Assault, and he revealed today that in terms of Chinese Communist Party documents revealed by a Chinese defector, people called old friends of Beijing in the West included 3 people. Can you guess who they are? Pierre Trudeau,
Henry Kissinger,
and Jacques Chrétien. So I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? Okay, this is from a Chinese defector saying 2 Canadian prime ministers and a secretary of state of enormous influence are friends of Beijing. This is the whole theme of the talk today. Will Mark Carney someday turn up on, a Chinese Communist Party document as an old friend of Beijing? Well, he looks like a friend when he's in a photo with Xi Jinping, or if he's getting a $276 million loan for Brookfield, right? He looks like a friend. And that encompasses everything we're talking about here today.
Well, what's interesting is the level of influence that China has in the World Economic Forum. And once again, you have Mark Carney on the board, right? Again, it's like everywhere this guy goes, China follows. Now,
and Kissinger.
You're
saying he started, or he's one of the...
He was a founding... The long story short, the World Economic Forum is a CIA cutout, and if people want to research that, you can go ahead and do that. It's well-known fact, and Henry Kissinger was the guy who selected Klaus Schwab for the job to lead it. The World Economic Forum, when they first discovered it, was just a little conference of university professors from around Europe who would get together and talk about the economy and other things. It was Henry Kissinger and his intelligence connections that turned it into what it is. And Klaus Schwab was selected to be the front man for that. But that is not the subject of the conversation today. What's interesting to me...
If it was a CIA cutout, then it looks like China's taken over that cutout.
Well, this is the point, right? So when you're talking about the former CIA director working on behalf of China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Targeted, yeah.
Right? Now, this is the thing. This is just what we know. Right? Now, you want to talk about the Epstein files. You also have Mark Carney appearing at events close to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And by that, I mean in photos with them, clearly having a good time. Right? Now, here's...
each other, yeah.
So...
They've been at some parties, yeah.
Well, here's the thing, and we're getting a bit off track here, and we're running late, and it's Christmas Eve for everybody watching this right now. It's Christmas Eve, so you probably have family stuff to do.
Go get some eggnog and rum.
I've read through the Epstein documents, a lot of them, not all 20,000 of them, but some of them. And what it appears to me is that Ehud Barak, who is the former Prime Minister of Israel, former head of the I believe, why am I blanking on this? I think he's the former director of the IDF, but he may be former Mossad director. I can't. That's escaping me right now. But the point is, this is a very powerful man, and in those documents, it does not look like Jeffrey Epstein is working for Israel. It appears that Israel and its intelligence agencies are working for him. So who is Jeffrey Epstein working with? That's the question. And you have this all-star cast around him, which includes Mark Carney. So what I'm getting at here, Sam, is that I have this deep suspicion that China is involved in far more than we know.
This is what I took from, again, I don't even know to this day what the Epstein files are about. And I've been very cautious and careful about all the speculation of...
You're already the inglorious former journalist, Sam Cooper. You don't need to go further into
that. We don't know who he was working for or who was working for him or vice versa. What we do know, when I saw that he and Larry Summers were talking about Larry Summers' relationship with someone who is obviously from a a very elite Chinese Communist Party family, that told me that, yeah, whoever Epstein was, at the same time he's talking to an elite in America, he's talking to, or he's aware of elites in China. He's aware of elites in Russia. He's aware of elites, obviously, in Israel. He's aware of elites around the world. And China, what I took, there were two data points so far that show very important people from China somehow tied up in that. So yeah, I mean, we'd be foolish not to think that these think tanks or multilaterals around the world, whoever set them up, there's no question in my mind that various states are in there and are trying to control them, and the business people involved through cutouts and various layers. I just get more and more sense, by the month, of how complex the world is, put it that way.
Yeah, well, it is. And Sam, as we coast toward wrapping this up, there's just two more checkpoints I want to hit. First is Mark Carney's election campaign, because you already talked about an instance where he's photographed with Chinese spies in Toronto, right? There's also another instance, I don't know if we're referencing the same one, but there's also another instance in Vancouver where he's meeting with members of the JCCC, right? Which is
vice versa. Yeah.
Vice versa. So
yeah, I referred to this in my testimony. He meets with something called the Jiangsu Chamber in Toronto, just as it's him and Chrystia Freeland running for, let's call it nominee to run for prime minister. We know at the time that China is against Chrystia Freeland, is attacking her in their propaganda channels in Canadian diasporas. And he meets with the Jiangsu Chamber and their leaders. Now, to unpack it very briefly, in my reporting, I tied the Jiangsu Chamber to, you remember my story about a Markham illegal casino.
Yes.
And how Canadian security as well as York Regional Police were sharing information about concerns at that casino. And so the Jiangsu Chamber ties up with overtly recognized Beijing United Front Work Department groups. It ties up with an executive director, I believe, of a liberal riding. So let's unpack that for a second. You've got someone on a purported, Chinese Chamber of Commerce in Toronto who is a Liberal Party riding boss, who is connected to people involved in a Markham illegal casino, and the whole body is tied to the United Front Work Department. So Mark Carney is meeting with this business group who, as I said before, the little Mandarin language write-up about it says that it looks like Mark Carney could help reset relations, and improve relations between Canada and China. So him showing up there, I say, when I'm just stepping back, my expert assessment is he is working for the extremely important votes in the Greater Toronto ridings, which we know have been targeted for Chinese election interference in the past two federal elections. And by Beijing showing these Jiangsu Chamber leaders standing beside Mark Carney, they're signaling to the Chinese diaspora, this is the guy to vote for. So I'll just add one little more layer on that. I said, I believe it was in another podcast with someone else. It was with Dr. Charles Burton. You're in august company. I told I told Charles Burton that my information from my diaspora sources was these people from the Jiangsu Chamber were instrumental in getting John McCallum, who was then Chinese ambassador and a former MP right in this area of Toronto, in getting him to come out and give a press conference calling for the release of Man Wanzhou, calling her detention apparently illegal. By the way, the same message as Jean Chrétien, an old friend of Beijing. Both John McCallum and Jean Chrétien would be called friends of Beijing, although Jean Chrétien, being a prime minister, much more important friend.
Right.
So yeah, that's the meaning of the Jiangsu Chamber. There's a benefit for Mark Carney going to that meeting, and China is showing the diaspora through its reporting, this is who we want to be prime minister. You asked about Vancouver. Again, in my testimony for Ottawa, I was asked, I think, about one of my posts on X, where I referred to my colleague Bob Macken's video reporting showing Mark Carney meeting with a Vancouver United Front Work Department representative, along with MP Parm Bains, who, if we've probably talked about, was part of what I believe should be called a textbook foreign interference operation, likely reflected in the 2024 NSI COP report. And as I say, what happened there was Parm Bains was interviewed on one of these Chinese cutout media, in the 2021 campaign, and asked, what do you think about your opponent, Kenny Chu's, raising this foreign agent registry? Parm Bains says, oh, it sounds like a very discriminatory policy. I can't support that. Days later, senior United Front Work Department leaders of the type that are pictured with Xi Jinping in China, cannot make this up at all. We can go to the video and show it. You could see a guy that's campaigning with Parm Bains in 2021. In 2023, I believe he's right there, standing beside Xi Jinping. So it sounds like textbook foreign interference to me, one of the serious cases of NSI COP. Let's jump forward to the campaign of 2025. Mark Carney, Parm Bains, and United Front leaders in Vancouver. A mirror image of that Toronto meeting with the Jiangsu Chamber, I would say.
Yeah. So what comes from there is a onslaught of Chinese propaganda via WeChat to the Chinese diaspora in Canada, pro-Carney propaganda.
Pro-Carney.
Which, again, remember, when you have, let's say, 1 million plus Chinese nationals living in Canada who spend a lot of time on WeChat, which, for those who don't know, WeChat is China's version of WhatsApp, being exposed to this constant propaganda, you have to imagine that it would amount to at least 500,000 votes for Carney out of that, right? We end up, Carney is elected. Yeah, whatever. Numbers may be off, but you know what I mean. It's an influence campaign.
Yeah.
Carney is elected prime minister. In the months that follow, of course, the Trump story continues. This whole thing with the tariffs and the 51st state and elbows up and all that other stuff, all that other bullshit. But where this all crescendos, at least for now, is in this recent meeting with Mark Carney and Xi Jinping. And that's where I want to end this, Sam. So can you talk about what came out of that meeting, and was there anything that you saw in the outcome that concerned you?
Yeah, I talked with Charles Burton, who's more expert on the diplomatic tea leaves and signs, and he noted that even before that meeting between Carney and Xi, China's ambassador in Canada, in Ottawa, at the embassy there, was on a sort of a media tour and, being quoted in the Canadian press that it's time to reset relations between Canada and China, and for Canada to see it in the correct way. And as Charles Burton said, the correct way for Beijing means seeing it under their terms and their way.
Yeah.
And then recall, this is the exact same message as reflected in the Jiangsu Chamber write-up of their spies in Toronto meeting with Mark Carney for a grip and grin and signaling to the diaspora that Carney's the guy to vote for. I say that story says, Mark Carney's the one that, will be positive for that reset. Canada, China need a reset. Mark Carney's the guy. So, okay, now we've got the Chinese ambassador in Ottawa saying the same thing. Mark Carney secures that meeting with Xi Jinping, with Prime Minister, which is a reward of sorts. Certainly, important in whatever's going on in the tariff negotiations, whether you see that as good or bad. And what comes out of that meeting is, as Charles Burton told me, he's a sinologist. He can read China's write-up of what they say happened. He can see, what Mark Carney said. And he said that Mark Carney's language reflected Chinese Communist Party messaging, that it was time for, a new pragmatic, if I'm recalling correctly, I believe I am, pragmatic relationship between Canada and China. And in the expert Charles Burton's words, that is Chinese Communist Party language. So Mark Carney, in language that we can understand and be shocked by, says that Canada and China will be strategic allies, which is just a wrong statement. No one should be saying that. Even if you're saying we're having a tough time with Washington, Washington's being mean to Europe, mean to Canada, mean to most everyone in the world. They're resetting lines. It'll never be the same. I don't care. Even if all that's true, much of it probably is. But you never say Canada will be a strategic ally with Beijing. Beijing is going around the world killing dissidents. This is what we know now. Targeting people in Canada, potentially with lethal force. And so, yeah, Carney is speaking Beijing's language. That's it. That's what I take out of that meeting.
Yes, that's exactly what I took away as well. It's that you have this guy who is in the upper echelons of finance, politics. I mean, he's the perfect executioner who is parachuted in and installed as Canada's prime minister right at a moment where Canada's relationship with our brother, right? The nation that we share a border with, the one that we are culturally most similar to, almost, identical to, our long storied trade partner we fought in 2 world wars with, right as that there's a point of fracture in that relationship, he's rushed in, installed this guy who appears to be who appears to be tangled up with China on a multitude of levels in a number of ways. And what I saw come out of that meeting was, I hate to say this, but the nail in our coffin. In conclusion, and Sam, I'm sure you'll agree with me on this, as Canada comes closer and closer to China, the United States is not going to sit and just watch this happen. We share a border with them. We are under threat of becoming one giant intelligence hub for China right on the American border. And I've said this a million times, but I'll say it again. Historically, whenever you have a superpower with a middle power bordering it and another superpower that is attempting to use that middle power as an agent of influence, the superpower bordering that middle power tends to invade. Russia and Ukraine is a very good example of this, recent example. We are on the brink here in Canada because what we have done through this with Mark Carney, with our strengthening relationship with China, our growing relationship with China, I should say, we are poking the bear to the south of us, and it's a bad one. No matter how you feel about Trump or the United States or America in general, we are provoking them to have to act because we are inviting the Chinese in, and Mark Carney was the perfect guy to do it. Right?
Yeah, I agree with you. It raises some thoughts in my mind. I'd like people to think about them over the holidays. They're enjoying time with their family. There were reports that it's being mused in Washington that Canada should be ejected from the Five Eyes. A lot of people thought that was crazy and couldn't happen, but I'm hearing from multiple sources, and we've probably talked about it before. This is not just a Donald Trump thing. This has been a deep concern, from Democrats and Republicans and across US agencies for many years now, that Canada has moved far too close to Beijing's orbit. So, as I reported in my book, Willful Blindness, even back in 2018, when I was talking to US officials about what's going on in Vancouver and British Columbia, I knew that that is US officials and agencies, had deep concerns about Beijing's footprint in Vancouver through organized crime, through real estate ownership, through more complex, technological and espionage operations.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know a lot more now, but over 5-6 years ago, I had the sense that if Canada could not take care of its own security, we risked, if you want to put it this way, giving away more security to the United States, who would have to take care of the threats in Canada. And if you look at where we are right now, I think that's where we are. The United States has said enough is enough. Maybe President Biden didn't have the acuity at the end of his term to even put it in those terms, but people in his government certainly had the view that Canada was overrun, saturated, struggling to stay afloat, as Dennis Molinaro says in his new book, right, under assault. So yeah, I agree with you. And I think the question of our times is, what nations in the West will be there shoulder by shoulder defending democracy? It's already under deep assault from Russia in Ukraine, which is a messy, complex case. So that's the story of Canada, if we want to focus on Canada and United States. And so what does that mean? I mean, we as Canadians need to think towards the next election. Do you get one more chance to elect a government that actually could renew the sovereignty of Canada, which is, I believe, deeply under threat from many different channels?
Yeah.
One of the main ones being transnational organized crime, which we haven't really even talked about this episode. So yeah, I mean, but it is Christmas Eve. We're taping before Christmas Eve. Yeah. I want to end with what I think is a positive, from my, a lot of times you've kind of asked me, why do you do what you do at the Bureau, or where did you come from to do this? I've been looking in, I already knew, but I've been, with a renewed passion looking into my family's history. And, sides of my family have been in Canada since the 1800s. Some of them were pioneer merchants, which literally, helped build the economy and land in Saskatchewan. There's a place called the W.W. Cooper store, which grew into what was called the Co-op, a pretty big enterprise in Saskatchewan. Another side of the family came over from Scotland and was working with Ontario Hydro, building this nation. I looked all the way back to the 1600s, where part of my family came over from Netherlands, being experts in dike building, and were contracted by the King of England to sort of drain out the fenlands, and they helped build Britain, and then came over to the prairies in Canada and contributed their knowledge and ranching. So I just feel maybe when I look inside myself, maybe that's part of why, I'm so motivated to try to, I think, bolster this country and bolster the project of Western democracy, which emerged for us, I think, from the United Kingdom and the British Isles.
Yeah.
That's where I'm tracing my ancestors. And that's why I say, yeah, we are the same as our brothers and sisters in the United States that built up North America in in democracy and trade and capitalism. So that's where I'm coming from. I didn't want to end on a gloomy note. That's just a little bit of sharing that's been on my mind.
Yeah, I guess I can share too. I found out recently that I am a descendant of a very. I'm not going to say the name because if I do, everybody's going to call bullshit, and I'm not going to say the name. But I do. I have the paperwork. My brother, after many years of fighting, finally received his Indian status, and my lineage traces all the way back to a very, very famous Indian chief. So my family lineage is hundreds of years deep on this land as well. And, the thing is, man, is to end this on a positive note as well, Sam, you and I've considered shutting down Brave New Normal a number of times. And the only reason I never have is because of you and our conversations here. And brother, it's been almost 3 years. And I feel like you and I, we've done something special together, man. I mean, you do the work, of course, that's special, but our conversations have reached millions and millions of people around the world. And, I get people reaching out to me all the time about our discussions. And I think that I don't know, man. I think there's something about when you and I come together and we have these discussions, we bring something out of each other. So, my brother, in closing, I just want to say, man, it's an honor to be your friend, an honor to work with you. And, dude, another year of me dragging you into the darkness, into the rabbit holes.
Oh, I agree. Like that, the Belt and Road deal that Mr. Carney sponsored, I didn't have that data point. And like I say, that really bolsters what I think about what he was up to back then. And to your point about people watching these clips, I won't say too much to identify, but I got a message from someone in Quebec that had listened to one of our conversations and said they were part of a political campaign that quite clearly looked like it was it suffered from a type of corruption and interference. Yeah. Where another party appeared to benefit, another party that will remain nameless. But this person said, she said, thanks for thanks for what you're doing. We're behind you. So, Joyeux Noël to our peoples in Quebec as well.
Yeah, brother, the crazy thing is like through our conversations I've had, intelligence people, military people, very, very powerful people in the world of business and politics reach out to me. All people who wanted to, remain private and anonymous, but we're doing something here, man. We're reaching people. And, in 2026, I'm going to start turning my attention away from Canada and onto the world as you have been doing. And you and I'm going to drag your ass back in here every couple of weeks, as always. And we'll talk about Canada and we'll talk about other parts of the world. But, dude, I cannot stress how important you are to just the survival of this nation. I have an inbox full of bureau reporting that I haven't read yet that I'm saving up for the holiday to get me through because I know things are going to slow down as this industry usually does. But dude, it's everybody's going to fast forward to this because it's just me kissing your ass. But dude, it's an honor, man. It's been an honor to do this together. I look forward to another year of us doing this and fuck, man, maybe somehow, some way turning something around,
Yeah, likewise. We get into some great stuff. So thank you. And to everyone, Merry Christmas, and just enjoy your time with your family.
And as Sam said, think about China while you're passing the gravy. So Sam, before we get out of here, where can everybody find you?
Go to thebureau.news. Let's try to get up from 30 to 40,000 this in 2026. So thebureau.news and also at Scooper Cooper on X.
Guys, I say this every time. Sam is top of the mountain journalism. The Bureau is where I go. I read every morning with my morning coffee. The Bureau is number one. That's where I start. That's my starting point every single day. It's Christmas Eve. There's somebody in your life that you haven't bought a gift for yet. Buy them a paid subscription to the Bureau. Honestly, if somebody did that for me and I didn't have one, I'd be like, holy shit, that's amazing. Guys, sign up at thebureau.news, but don't just sign up for free. Sign up as a paid subscriber. Everything you heard here today is kind of, we condensed maybe 50 different stories that Sam has done on the Bureau into a 2-hour conversation. Sam is able to do what he does because he's completely reader funded. He is completely funded by his subscribers. He does not do anything else. He does not have private funding. He does not have a Mark Carney in the distance sending him millions of dollars to push propaganda out into the world. That's why the Bureau is what it is. So if you want Sam to continue to be balls to the wall, burn the boat, Sam Cooper, sign up as a paid subscriber. Also follow Sam on X at Scooper Cooper. I am a habitual refresher of his feed. And if you follow him, you will be too. Merry Christmas, everybody. I hope you guys enjoyed the special. Sam, can I drag you back in here in January?
Yeah, 2026. We'll do it again.
Here we go, baby.